Who can tell me what this is? Close.
The new red dog?
No, the new red dog. Just shout it out if anybody knows what that is. Pile of dirt. Very good. All right. Now, I'm sure you're probably already wondering, why is Brett showing us a picture of dirt? That's a good question. The answer is because 3 weeks ago, when I was presenting on Jesus healing the leper, is that during that study, we surveyed all the cases of leprosy in the Bible, and during which we came across Naaman, and he was a Syrian commander, and he was the only biblical example prior to Jesus' time that was healed of leprosy. And that was, after the Old Testament law was codified. Moses and Miriam's were supernatural from God, but every natural case, nothing was ever healed up until Jesus' time. Now, since he was a Jew, but a foreign pagan, the Levitical priestly rites in Leviticus 14 never played out until Jesus' time. But we know that after Naaman was healed, was that he acknowledged and said, "There is no God in all the earth but in Israel." Now, the typical sermon or study on Naaman will focus around his conversion from paganism to the one true God. Us, however, are going to focus in on one thing that usually gets passed over all too often, and that's Naaman's request in verse 17 for as much dirt from Israel that 2 donkeys can pull back to Damascus in Syria. As most of you probably know, is that pack donkeys are extremely strong and coordinated animals. The way God designed them, you have to just assume he did it in a way for the main purpose of carrying or pulling cargo from one place to another for very long distances, including the rough terrain of the ancient Near East. Donkeys are estimated to be able to pull twice their weight, and since they can weigh from 100 to 1,300 pounds, is that you can imagine they could almost pull a ton of dirt on the way back. And since Naaman was a servant of the Syrian king, is that you can assume that he's got the best donkeys in all the land. So, his request for as much as 2 donkeys can pull is that we are talking about at least 2,000 pounds plus of dirt being taken back to Damascus. This isn't your typical tourist souvenir from the Holy Land where people give me a little vial of dirt, they take it back home. This request is that there's something theological going behind this for Naaman. And since the biblical author found it important enough to mention it to us, is that there's something in there as well for us too. So, to unravel this dirty mystery, bad joke, but is that our first clue is found in the second half of verse 17 that says, "For your servant will never again offer a burnt offering or sacrifice to a god other than the Lord." So Naaman's request for Israeli dirt is somehow tied to his desire to only worship Yahweh, the God of Israel, going forward in his days, and to do so through ritualistic sacrifices is that it requires him to have dirt from Israel brought back to Damascus. Which just keeps begging the question for us, why does it matter what type of dirt that he has at his disposal? Why does the geography matter? Naaman's heart is in the right place as he finishes saying, "May the Lord forgive your servant for this one thing. When my master, the king, enters the temple of Rimmon to worship, and he leans on my arm and I bow down in the temple of Rimmon, may the Lord forgive me for this." So Naaman's heart, mind, and soul are all about Yahweh at this point. He doesn't even want to accidentally sin by kneeling down with the elderly Syrian king during his pagan worship. And here's Elisha's response to his dirt request. "Go in peace." So Elisha said, "Go ahead. Take the ton of dirt back home and don't worry about that setting where you have to kneel down with the king during pagan worship. The Lord knows where your faith is at." Elisha understands why Naaman not just wants the Israeli dirt, but actually needs it in order to be able to sacrifice to the Lord. In the scholarly world, this concept is known as cosmic geography. Now, I screenshotted this from Logos, which is the most put together scholarly package of digital archives of articles, books, and so forth that you can find. So what I'm pointing out here is I'm not making this up. This is getting into the ancients' concept of territorial gods or patron gods. The most classic example of this is Athens, Greece, because their patron goddess is Athena. To the Athenians, Athens was Athena's turf. And for Naaman, Ramon was the deity over Damascus. And when you dig into the background of Ramon, the pagan god here, is that he is associated with Baal worship in the ancient Near East, who in the Bible is ultimately connected to Satan, Beelzebub. So Naaman needed dirt from Israel to worship Yahweh properly because that was his turf. And this concept appears quite a bit in the Old Testament and New Testament if you have never caught it before. So I'm just not going to overload you, but here are 3 examples from the Old Testament where you see cosmic geography on display. The first is with David, with King Saul. It's not the example here where Saul is chasing after David and David, cuts off a piece of his cloak in the cave to show like, hey, look, I could have killed you, but I didn't. I'm still faithful to you. It's actually the second occurrence where David's life is spared. And this is in 1 Samuel 26. Here's David's words to Saul. Now therefore, I pray thee, king, let my lord the king hear the words of his servant. If the Lord have stirred thee up against me, then let him accept an offering. But if it be the children of men, cursed be they before the Lord. For they have driven me out this day from abiding in the inheritance of the Lord, saying, go serve other gods. You can see the connection between whose land you're on affects which God you can worship. The inheritance language is speaking of the promised land, and since David was forced out by Saul's people to foreign land, is that David's adversaries and David himself are acknowledging, he'll come back, is that David is now cut off from his ability to sacrifice and worship Yahweh properly in the land. The next story is earlier in 1 Samuel 5 with the pagan god Dagon in the Ark of the Covenant. This one might be a little more familiar to you. The Philistines had captured the ark from the Israelites after a battle took place. The Philistines took the ark and placed it in the temple of Dagon by his statue. Now the next morning, the priests of Dagon saw that the statue was broken into many pieces in front of the ark. What's going on here is that the Philistines thought they had essentially captured Israel's God, and by placing the ark by Dagon is that it showcased how their God was more powerful than Israel's God. But Yahweh is not going to have that thought in anyone's head. So he toppled over the statue during the night, and now look at what the pagan priests say in response to this. Verse 5. Therefore, neither the priests of Dagon nor anyone that comes into Dagon's house tread on the threshold of Dagon in Ashdod unto this day. The pagan priests won't walk on the part of their temple where the ark sat, because in their thinking, the God of Israel now owns that turf and had defeated it from their God. The funny thing is that if you read the rest of the story, is that the Philistines started shipping the ark around from one city to another. But every time that they kept moving it to that next city, huge calamity came over that city and they got beat up, and they're like, no, get this thing out of here. Supernaturally, we're getting just destroyed here. To where eventually they sent the ark back on a wagon with 2 cows pulling it back. There was no people involved, and that little scene of those guys hiding out behind there it's kind of the description that you get in there. The cows mooed all the way back to Israel. This story and the other Mount Sinai descriptions actually provide that backdrop to Raiders of the Lost Ark with Indiana Jones, when they come in and start asking him, what is the Ark of the Covenant and whatnot. And if you remember the scene, Indy says that it's a weapon that Israel used in their wars. and that's why, Hitler wanted to grab it. Now, that's not correct, but that's just how the movie used it. And is there any kids in here under 40 know what Indiana Jones is even? So, all right, maybe not. And my third story of this is in Daniel 10 with verses 13 and 20 that describe the angel Gabriel battling with the prince of Persia with another being called the prince of Greece that is to come after him. Now, when you get into this prophecy setting, is that these beings are clearly supernatural because Gabriel is obviously an angel. And so if to argue against the prince of Persia being not an angel as well, or in this case an evil one, is like, well, how did he withstand Gabriel if he was just human? It doesn't make sense. So he's an evil entity as well. This prince language is also applied to Michael, the archangel, in verse 21, with him being described as Israel's protector. Now, holistically, looking at these examples, is that two questions could and maybe have already come into your mind. First is, do we see this idea playing out in the New Testament at all, or is Brett just still making all this stuff up? And the other is, what is the origin of this idea? Because if all cultures in the ancient Near East, which includes Israel, seem to agree on this worldview of gods over top of turf, then it had to have come from somewhere or from some event. So let's tackle the origin story first. And anytime you want to tackle the beginning of something, what book do you turn to? Genesis. And anyone want to take a shot at what story in Genesis I might be alluding to? Chapter 11 with the Tower of Babel. There's more to this story than you probably have ever realized, and really how important it is to the whole metanarrative of the Bible. And what I mean by that is the big overarching story of God's redemption of humanity and the whole earth back unto himself. And so we're speaking in the 30,000 foot range here right now. So here we go, Tower of Babel story verses 1 through 9. Now the whole earth had a common language and a common vocabulary. When the people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. Then they said to one another, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They had brick instead of stone and tar instead of mortar. Then they said, "Come, let's build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered across the face of the entire earth." But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the people had started building. And the Lord said, "If as one people, all sharing a common language, they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be beyond them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they won't be able to understand each other." So the Lord scattered them from there across the face of the entire earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why its name was called Babel, because the Lord confused the language of the entire world, and from there the Lord scattered them across the face of the entire earth. The main thing that is going on here is that they are rebelling against God and his Edenic vision. So in the garden he said, "Go forth and multiply across the whole earth," right? They didn't do that. They wanted to stay condensed, and they fought against it. It got repeated after the flood to Noah and to his sons as well, and they know this, but they're going against the plan. And so once again, humanity is rejecting God's charge and saying to him, "We're just going to go our own route and just be in a total act of defiance. We don't even care about what happened to the flood back there. We know you're not going to do it again." But to prevent humanity from going beyond the point of no return, like the pre-flood world, is that the Lord chose to confuse their languages and force them to scatter. Now, we know a little bit more about this story in the prior chapter. And this is chapter 10. That's just a big giant list of names, a genealogy list. Probably something when you're reading the Bible, you're like, okay, son of so, you don't really think a whole lot about it. It's not a boring chapter when you get into this context. Moses isn't just filling up the pages. in each line of Noah's 3 sons is that it says that their lines had their languages and multiple nations being formed from their lines. The final verse in chapter 10 reiterates the division of the nations. This is in reference to the Tower of Babel, when their common language got confused into multiple languages. Now, the other thing you can gather from chapter 10 is that when you count the number of nations in each line is that the grand total is 70. And let me say that up front is that this is not a coincidence. Now, after the scattering of the nations, who knows what the Lord is recorded doing next in Genesis? The call of Abraham, where God told Abram that he will make a great nation that will come from his descendants. Essentially, this is Yahweh saying this is his nation that he is going to rule over, whereas the 70 other nations were disinherited by the Lord for their rebellion. Now, I said that the 70 wasn't a coincidence, and that is because Genesis 46, God tells Jacob to take his whole caravan down to Egypt and make a great nation down there. The fact that Jacob's caravan was 70 in total is in stark contrast to Babel's 70. They, the readers of Moses, would know that God is taking his 70 people down there into the most powerful nation of the 70 at that time, and he's going to poke them in the eye with saying, this is my people now. Now, I'm sure if you went through those 9 verses with me, is that you're probably saying in your head, well, Brett, I get all that story, but I saw no mentioning of patron gods or deities in that whole thing. Correct? Well, back in 11:7, the Lord said, come, let us go down. Who's the us in this? Possibly. Has the Father left heaven to come to earth? So, I'm going to argue is that it's the heavenly host, i.e., it's angels. How I'm going to argue for that interpretation is that the division of the nations actually gets brought up again by Moses, but not in Genesis, but in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 32, 7-9. Remember the days of old, consider the years of many generations, ask your father, and he will show you, your elders, and they will tell you. When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided up mankind, he fixed the borders of the people according to the number of the sons of God. But the Lord's portion is his people. Jacob is his allotted heritage. It's clear that Moses was referring to the division of the nations at Babel here. There's simply no other story prior to this point that could be a possibility. The quick side note here is that, yes, I'm aware that if you're looking in other Bible versions, is that they say according to the sons of Israel instead of the angelic view of sons of God. Why the angelic view wins the day, textually, is for 3 reasons. One is that historically, Tower of Babel occurred well over 200 years before Israel's existence. So doing it according to something that doesn't even exist just doesn't make any sense. The second is that the manuscript evidence that predates the New Testament by 200 years plus all goes with the angelic view. The rabbinic Masoretic text, where most Old Testaments are based off of, up until like the KJV and then into modern day versions, a lot of them, they made that switch from the angelic view to the sons of Israel. There was a lot of stripping away of the supernatural aspect in the Old Testament with the rise of Christianity that was going on at the same time. Third is textual consistency within Deuteronomy itself, because in Deuteronomy 4:19-20 is that it perfectly parallels 32:8-9's description. The phrase in 4:19, the host of heaven, is clearly talking about supernatural beings, where Moses describing how people went and started worshiping them, which explains the origin of paganism in the world. If you were to track on the Hebrew words for inheritance, is that you will see that these are the ones that are used throughout the Torah and the book of Joshua when they go through the conquest of Canaan. But as you skim through the usage, is that you will come across our earlier example of David in 1 Samuel 26:19. And this is him being kicked out of the land, the inheritance of the Lord. This worldview provides a deeper understanding of why the exile, when the Jews were kicked out of Judea after Babylon had conquered them, was so devastating to their mind, because they're out of the land. They were out of God's land where God was. They're now under foreign land with foreign gods. And it also provides some context to Jude 9's kind of weird statement, if you will, of Michael and Satan arguing over Moses' body. Because if you go into the very end of Deuteronomy, Moses is buried outside of the land. He was buried in Moab because God said, you're not permitted in, because, he had a little tiff with God when he struck the rock and wasn't being obedient. So he kept him out of the land. So being out of the land was being out of God's land, which meant you're on enemy's turf at that point. Now, there's probably a lot more questions that you could possibly have in your head about, what's up with the whole sons of God? Were they always bad? Were they good at one point? Did they rebel? And so forth. That is a whole nother topic unto itself. So I'm trying to keep this up here in the 30,000 foot level. But hopefully, maybe in a couple weeks, I do keep preaching, possibly. We'll see. And I can unpack more of that in later talks. Now let's address, though, the New Testament side. Because if I am correct, this should pop up in there in at least one spot, if not more. And probably what most would really want to say is, are there really any explicit references to this? Or is it just an illusion and where, I'm just kind of conflating things? The answer is that yes, there are explicit references to it. The most explicit reference is quite telling because of the context in which it was stated. And that's when Paul addressed the Athenians on Mars Hill in Acts 17, verses 23 through 26. For as I passed by and beheld your devotions, I found an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. Whom therefore you ignorantly worship, him I declare unto you. The God that made the world and all their things in, seeing that he is Lord of heaven and earth, dwells not in temples made with hands, neither is worshipped with men's hands, as though he is needed anything, seeing he gives to all life and breath and all things, and has made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on all the face of the earth, and has determined the times beforehand, and the bounds of their habitation. On the scholarly end, there is consensus that Paul is citing Deuteronomy 32:8's Babel outcome here. I'll let it load here so we can actually see these. And why Paul knew that this reference would resonate with the Athenian audience is because he knew their own famous Greek philosopher Plato mentioned it as well. In one of his dialogues between these four people, in which probably the fourth one is pretty famous, Socrates, is that Plato cites Critias describing the ancient world 9,000 years before this, and he says the following occurred at that time. In the days of old, the gods had the whole earth distributed among them by allotment, but governed us like pilots from the stern of the vessel, holding our souls by the rudder of persuasion according to their own pleasure. Thus did they guide all mortal creatures. Now different gods had their allotments in different places, which they set in order. And a little bit later in the same dialogue, he says, Critias keeps saying the following. I have beforehand remarked in speaking of the allotment of the gods that they distributed the whole earth into portions differing in extent and made for themselves temple and instituted sacrifices. So you get the whole pagan origin story again here. The only difference between this and Deuteronomy 32 is that they don't have God, the real God, in the equation, which Paul rightly informs the Athenians that the unknown God that they're worshiping is the one who actually divided up the nations and why the world is the way it is at this point in time. 2 chapters later, Paul is in Ephesus preaching the gospel, and he tells them all to drop the false gods. And if you remember the story, he gets into a big thing because they make a lot of money off of the temple sacrifices and those who make the little statues and so forth at the temple of Artemis. So they get mad because he's messing with their whole economy and some other things as well. And the riot breaks out and they're yelling at him, "Get out of here. Diana is our god." Why I bring this story up is because later in Paul's letter to the Ephesians, he says something very familiar to all of us in 6:12. "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places." It's clearly supernatural because the first line says we're not wrestling against what? People. We're wrestling against the cosmic evil forces behind the scene that are driving humanity into the gutter. It's clearly supernatural, and they also are described with governmental authority over them, or with them, over the nations. And this language you'll find a lot with Paul if you go through Colossians and even earlier in Ephesians as well. For Jesus, his sending out of the 70 in Luke 10 is not a coincidental number either. It harkens the 70 of Israel and the 70 nations of Babel. And that this 70, when they were sent out and they came back, they said, even the devils were subject unto them, which is another description of the gods in the foreign lands. What Luke is telling the reader is that God's redemptive plan of taking back the 70 disinherited nations is taking place at this point in time. Now, the big final spot here in the New Testament where this kind of pulls it all together is with Pentecost, which will now make a lot more sense, I hope, because when the apostles were filled with the Holy Spirit, they began to speak in numerous languages. Where outside of that place, we are told that people from every nation under heaven were confused because they were hearing the apostles speaking in all their own national languages. This description is the same wording as Genesis 11, but it's done with a reverse effect where the apostles are now getting everybody to understand them, where at Babel everyone was getting confused by their plan. So now everyone is going to be hearing the gospel message. Luke continues in verses 9 through 11 with a whole list of languages and peoples that were there that day, and basically it covers the entire Roman Empire at that time. And at that time in history, Rome was the fourth Gentile empire over the entire world. But this was done by Luke to remind the reader, namely of Genesis 10 with the table of nations. And in verse 12, the witnesses there asked, well, what does this mean? They're still confused. What it means is that God's plan to reclaim the nations and reverse the effects of Babel is now in full mode with the coming of the Holy Spirit. So, when Jesus told the disciples to therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, was that he was telling them that what took place with Naaman, as a small example, is now going to happen with everyone across the entire world. God's people is no longer going to be constricted to ethnic Israel, but it's going to include every nation under heaven. So, that's a lot about dirt, just about dirt, isn't it? But what I hope that story, just dovetailing off of that story, maybe brought some clarity as to why would he ask for dirt? Why does it seem like these things are scattered throughout the Bible? Is because this is part of God's big meta-narrative of redeeming the whole earth back unto him. And so it's part of the gospel message as well. So if you're confused, I get it. It's been about 5 years of kind of cycling through this material for myself. At the beginning, it was just like, what in the world? But when you start seeing the dot connections, is that, for me, what it did was that it brought a whole new level of coherence between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Because when you look at Genesis 1 through 11, and you see the fall, the pre-flood world, and then Babel, and then you go to Revelation, it's just a complete undoing of all those effects, in which we know the end, and we understand the middle and the beginning. This is the in-between that just connects it all together. Reminder, hit the subscribe button below, turn on the notification bell, hit the like button, and leave a comment. And don't forget to visit us at justscripture.org. But in the meantime, stay salty.